Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Human Rights Council 49th sessions side event on monitoring process on violations against displaced Syrians. I would like to start by thanking the sponsors of the event, Cairo Institute for Human Rights, 1111, SCM, the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, Voices for Displaced Syrians Forum, Amnesty International, Refugee Protection Watch Coalition, and the Syrian Legal Development Program. Please let me start with some housekeeping notes. This session is recorded, and please be aware of that. It will be recorded and then will be shared publicly on social media. There is an interpretation offered in Arabic and English. If you would like to hear the translation into one of those two languages, please go to the low right side of the screen. You can see the three dots, and under that you can find interpretation. There you can select the channel that you would like to hear to. And please remember to mute the original audio so you can hear the translation clearly. Also, for any support or any IT issues, please drop our host a message on the chat box. The session will start with our panelists, a discussion with the three panelists, and then will be followed by Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, take notes of those questions. At the end, you can drop them directly into the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and our host will give you a slot to ask your questions. Then after that, we will close with recommendations by our three panelists. I would like to introduce our panelists to you. We are joined today by Marie Forstier. Marie is a researcher and advisor on refugee and migrants' rights for the MENA region at Amnesty International. Willem Stays. Willem works as a policy and partnership advisor at 1111, which is part of the Refugee Protection Watch Coalition. Kinan Diab. Kinan is the coordinator of the Voices for Displaced Syrians Forum. I am Sama Kiki, and I am the Executive Director of the Syrian Legal Development Program, and I will be your moderator for today. I would like to start with a background about the issue we are focusing on today, the refugees and returnees issue. So the UNHCR statistics indicate that there are approximately 6.6 million Syrian refugees around the world, with the largest refugees population spread over 127 countries. The UNHCR also estimates that there is 6.7 million Syrians have become internally displaced. We all know the hostilities in many areas of Syria has declined. However, the UNHCR stresses that Syria is still considered an unsafe country for the return of refugees. And therefore, it will not facilitate mass returns in the absence of primary protection conditions. Additional to that, this was confirmed by the European Parliament resolution issued back in March 2021. This resolution affirmed that Syria is not a safe country to return to. Accordingly, the European Parliament calls on all member states of the EU to refrain from depriving certain groups of Syrians of their protection. Also, the resolution urged Lebanon, Turkey, and all other countries to suspend the deportation of Syrians to Syria against their will. In parallel, unfortunately, two European countries, Denmark and Sweden, have begun to consider or to reconsider the protection they have offered to people from Syria. This is based on their assessment that some areas of the country, for example, Damascus and Damascus countryside, are now safe for people to return. So please let me start with you, Marie. You are the author of the report by Amnesty, where you interviewed returnees, relatives of them, friends of them, to capture that first-hand experiences of them when they are returning to Syria. Could you please explain to us the findings of that report and share with us some of those very harsh experiences? Actually, the title of the report itself is very strong. You are going to your death. So could you please tell us more about that?
Thank you, Sama. Yes, so this report was released last September, and the title "You're Going to Your Death" was something that one relative of a refugee told someone returning to Syria, and advising against doing so because he was afraid. So that's the origin of the title. So very briefly, to tell you a little bit about the methodology and where all the findings derive from. In our report, we document 66 cases of violations against Syrian people who returned to Syria. It includes violations against 13 children and 15 women. And for this report, I interviewed 20 people who returned to Syria and 21 relatives of people returning to Syria. So all these were direct interviews. And the report covers return that occurred from 2018 until mid-2021, specifically to government-controlled area of Syria. And from any countries, so neighboring countries and also European countries, when I found some testimonies, but it's the vast majority covers people returning from neighboring countries. So there are three key findings in our report. The first key finding is that returnees have been targeted because they were refugees, because they left the country. There is this perceived, there is this perception that refugees and thus returnees have been affiliated with the opposition, and it derives directly from the displacement. The Syrian officials believe that refugees have been disloyal to their country for the simple fact that they have left, and also because of the place where they have sought refuge. For instance, there is this case of this woman who has stuck with me, a mother of two who returned from Lebanon to Syria, and at the Lebanese border crossing, she was interrogated by Syrian security forces, and an officer told her, "Why did you leave Syria? Why didn't you stay?" "It's because you don't like Bashar al-Assad and you don't like Syria. You're a terrorist. Syria is not a hotel that you can leave and return to when you want." And just after telling her that, the officer raped the woman and raped her daughter, a 5-year-old daughter. So that's why, in this case and 23 others, we make a direct connection and a direct link between the accusation of having left Syria, not having stayed in the country, and the violation refugees have been submitted to. The second key finding that derives from this is that all Syrians are at risk of suffering persecution. Not some of them, not some people because of their profile, because of their past activities. All of them are at risk because of the displacement, because they left the country. And that's key in the way of viewing Syrian refugees and in the way of considering protection that should be granted to Syrian refugees. And I would like to insist here that women are as much at risk as men. There is this common belief that women would be less at risk. In some cases, Syrian families send women back first in order to see the situation, thinking that nothing will happen to them, but that's not true. We documented a dozen of cases of women who returned alone without a male relative and were subjected to human rights violations. So women should be protected as much as men in this context. And the last key finding, and you touched on it earlier, is that no part of Syria is safe to return to, including Damascus. There is this assessment from some European countries that Damascus is safe, but our findings show that it is not the case. 1/3 of the violations we documented in the report took place in Damascus or in Damascus province. So it shows that it's not safe to return to any part of the country. And so that leads Amnesty International to conclude that any return to Syria would be a violation of international obligation of non-refoulement, and that's why no Syrian refugees should be returned at the moment. So now I will highlight the human rights violations documented in the report and supporting these findings. First of all, I documented sexual violence, 14 cases of sexual violence committed against men, women, and children. It includes the rape of 5 women and the rape of a 13-year-old boy and the rape of a 5-year-old girl. I would like to highlight this because I was not looking specifically for sexual violence cases when I did the research, and the fact that I found these cases when it is difficult to document this type of violation shows that it is a very worrying violation happening and targeting refugees. Then I would say the most common violation affecting Syrian people who return to Syria is arbitrary and unlawful detention. Out of the 66 cases documented, 59 were arbitrarily and unlawfully detained. It includes 2 pregnant women and 10 children. In the majority, they were younger than 4-year-old. The majority of returnees were detained, arrested and detained either just upon return, often at the border crossing, or shortly after returning. They were arrested on falsely based accusation of terrorism, either because of their relatives or because of the area they were from. And the detention was the occasion for Syrian authorities to extort a large amount of money from the families of the returnees. Then during this detention, it was very common for returnees to experience torture and other ill treatments. And women and children also have been tortured and ill-treated, according to our research. It unfortunately very much matches the pattern of torture and other ill-treatment that has taken place in Syria since the beginning of the conflict. So intelligence officers have subjected returnees to beating, the use of electricity, and the specific torture techniques that we have seen since the beginning of the conflict. And I will just give you the example of this man who returned from Lebanon and who was detained for 3.5 months in 4 different intelligence branches across the country. And he was, among other torture techniques, he was applied electricity. And he told me, I felt my whole brain was shaking when he was applied electricity. We also documented 27 cases of enforced disappearances and death in detention. At the time of writing, 17 cases of 17 enforced disappearances were still ongoing out of the 27. There is this example of this family of 5, 3 young children and 2 parents who returned from France a few years ago. And immediately when they crossed from the Lebanese crossing, they were arrested and they have been disappeared. It has been almost 3 years and have been no news from them since, including of the children. And also we documented some cases of death in detention. So 5 relatives of returnees who were arrested told us that they received a notification of death in custody. So the cause of the death is not known, but it is a very common way of proceeding for intelligence officials when someone dies in prison to just notify the family without telling the cause of the death. So all these violations I just highlighted led all the Syrian refugees who were able to, among those we talked to leave the country again. All those who were able to leave the country fled against Syria. So in the end, it's only 1/3 of the cases we documented. Why? Because some are still detained, some are still disappeared, some died, and others don't want to leave either because they want to stay in the country to find a relative, or because they cannot pay a smuggler, or they cannot go physically through a smuggling routes. So none of the refugees we talk to and who are staying in Syria do so because they feel safe. They do so because they don't have the choice. And so this is very telling that everyone who has returned and is able to leave the country again. And so I will highlight briefly our main recommendations deriving from our findings. So our first call is to European governments. We are calling them to grant the refugee status to people who have left Syria and to maintain their protection to Syrian refugees living in Europe. Second, we're calling mainly neighboring countries to end all deportations of refugees to Syria, as well as other forms of direct and indirect transfers, and to maintain their protection for Syrian refugees. And finally, we have some specific calls for Lebanon. We're calling Lebanon to provide a regular migration status to refugees in order to protect them from refoulement. We're also calling them to grant permission to UNHCR to once again register new refugees. And we are calling the Lebanese government to allow legal re-entry into Lebanon to refugees who returned to Syria and decided to live again, as I just described, because now they cannot go to Lebanon again safely and through a regular way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. From my own experience, one of my relatives actually had a friend who is Assad supporter, and after years in living in other country in Europe, he decided to come back, and he was Assad supporter, but still he was detained and tortured for 15 to 20 days. So this is also to know that regardless of your beliefs or your political position, you are still tortured because you left the country. Thank you so much, Marie. I would like to move to you, Kinan. So Kinan, the VDSF published a report asking a very important question: is Syria safe for return? And you tried to focus on the returnees' perspective. Could you please share with us the findings of that report? And if you would like to share any recommendations at the end, please do so.
Thank you very much. Well, mainly I cannot agree more with the report that Amnesty has provided. On a side note, actually, I remember when Marie was actually sharing like a summary of the findings of the report while we were, and again, like the results are literally screaming that Syria is not safe to return, and yet we were able to find persons who started questioning whether this report is representative of the situation of all returnees. And honestly, that was the core reason why we decided to go with the quantitative or mixed research. Again, all Syrians would agree, or like those working on the Syrian crisis know that yes, Syria is not safe to return. That's the simplest answer. But apparently we did need to have some quantitative data to support this fact. I'll try to go through, I'll probably go very quickly through the methodology we used, and probably share like the highlights some important numbers that we had through our study. So it won't be as maybe interesting, if that's the correct term to use, as what Marie was sharing, but it will probably give more of a statistical understanding of the context in Syria. So in a nutshell, our sample included, we collected 700 surveys. We tried to do this on a whole of Syria level because, again, the narrative regarding Syria is safe, as Marie mentioned, sometimes is narrowed down to like maybe parts of Syria is safe, so maybe we can send some of them back. So mainly we focused on the 6 areas. In northwest Syria, it was Azaz and Idlib. In northeast, it was Al-Raqqa and Qamishli. In regime-controlled areas, it was Damascus and Jaramana. In each of those locations, we did interview 100 returnees. And here we didn't only focus on returnees from abroad, but also returnees who crossed the lines, if that the territories, if that's the correct term. The same was applicable in all 3 areas. In addition to that, we did conduct interviews with 300 internally displaced persons in again the 3 locations, and we on top of that, we did interview 100 residents in GOS areas, in a sense that as we do have explicit multi-sectoral needs assessments in Northwest and Northeast Syria, but honestly, we like GOS areas might feel like wormholes sometimes, especially when it comes to accurate reports or numbers. We topped that up with 26 community interviews and 5 experts interviews to just get the broader picture. Now, you can definitely imagine that 41%, almost half of those returnees did not return voluntarily, according to their description. When we compare this to the sample in regime-controlled areas, only 21% said that they returned fully voluntarily, in a sense that almost 80% of them didn't, like they were either like forced or like they were pushed to return to Syria, which definitely supports the narrative that Amnesty was sharing. Furthermore, we like in our report, we like even for voluntary returns, push like even for those who consider themselves returning voluntarily, they said that the push factors were like a great had great impact on them to return. We can see now throughout the report, we will see the differences between internal returnees and returnees from abroad. Like again, with Marie setting the scene on returnees from abroad and the violations they were facing. Actually, the violations against internal returnees were way higher, in a sense that they were also considered either affiliates with the regime, if like in Northwest or Northeast, or spies, or those who are betraying their country, and like to the extent that for those who are returning from abroad, it was easier for them rather than those who are actually coming from other parts from within Syria. The top 3 push factors were the poor living situation in the host area, whether inside or outside the country, the unstable security situation, and for those, again, this is for voluntary returns, and for those outside the country, the security situation can also include and like or mainly included the legal status and how to have and how to obtain residency or like legal presence in the hosting country. And third was inability to continue studying. That was mainly for ID like returnees in Northwest and Northeast Syria who were forced, or like members of their family were forced to continue their education, their formal education in GOS controlled areas. If I'm going too fast, our translators feel free to just send me a message. I'll just try to be a bit slower in my speak. Now, what was even worrying is that almost only half of those returnees actually intended to return permanently inside Syria. The rest were either planning on visiting and they were not able to leave, or they were not able to go to there. We were in the sense that their residencies were expired or like not extended, or that they decided to just stay. In a sense that even the voluntary returnees don't have adequate information. So as Mary was mentioning, one of the ways the families were using is to like just test the water by sending a female member, and that was not always the safest option for them. I would like to highlight in this point that returnees don't have adequate information to base their decisions. What is completely worrying is that according to the statements of returnees, 13 out of the 300 mentioned that the United Nations helped facilitating their return. So again, it's based on their statements. But if that is the case, this is completely contradicting with the CPSS, the guidance that UNHCR has issued in 2018, that explicitly mentions that seriousness safe return and no assisted return should take place. Out of those 13, only 2 refer to themselves as voluntary returnees, in the sense that the rest were actually forced to return, and only 4 of those 13 persons mentioned that they were consulted or provided sufficient information before taking that decision. Now, physical safety, again, Marie shared some horrifying stories on returnees, and I will just be going through the numbers. For returnees overall, 11% reported physical violence within a year of their return, and 7% preferred not to answer. On that note, I would like to highlight that it was absolutely a nightmare to collect data to get returnees in especially government-controlled areas to actually feel confident enough to share with our numerators their experiences, reflecting the fear that they are living. The same challenge was actually in different levels in Northwest and Northeast Syria. Now, in returnees in GOS areas reported a higher percentage of arbitrary arrests. Again, speaking of physical violence for returnees, for internal returnees into as an overall, it was 30%. It reached almost 50% for internal returnees to regime controlled areas. If you compare it, it was 18% for those returning from abroad. This is what I'm sharing. What I meant with it's higher. There is a higher chance of one being of violations against internal returnees in comparison to returnees from abroad. In no sense that mean that it's safer for those returning from abroad to stay inside Syria. Discrimination in a sense of not allowing their children to be registered in schools, not being allowed humanitarian aid that they are entitled to, or not even being able to go back to their own jobs or professions. Again, we have the percentage overall was 27%, and for returnees inside US areas, it was almost 50%. It was higher in Damascus in comparison to Jaramana. I will just, in order to save time, I would urge you to go either through the report or the executive summary to go through the numbers. But it is worth mentioning that in our sample, which again, we are not claiming that it may be representative of all returnees, but it is a first of its kind report-wise. Gender-based violence and harassment were explicitly reported from regime-controlled areas. That again does not mean that it's not taking place in Northwest or Northeast Syria, but in our sample, that was these were the numbers we received. Now, when it comes to physical safety, we asked if people are feeling confident walking around at throughout the day in the neighborhood where they're living. And again, people who are not feeling safe walking in daylight in the neighborhood they're in, you can see that in regime controlled areas it's 57%, pretty that's over than half. Returnees in Northwest, 37% are not feeling safe to just walk around, and in HTS controlled areas this number jumps to 50%. It was relevantly safer for returnees in Northeast Syria, but still with 20% of them not feeling safe even walking around where the areas where they returned. Now, again, the concept of people returning, and this is definitely linked to durable solutions and how permanent this return is. Throughout the sample, only 17% of all returnees do not regret their decision The rest either regretted completely or partially. And you could see through the numbers that returnees from abroad have a higher percentage of rejecting regretting their decision in comparison to those returning internally, because the harsh conditions are somehow similar. Again, when it comes to legal safety or people trusting the law enforcement, only 20% of actually, like, it's an overall percentage is 15% in Northwest and Northeast Syria. It was 20% of people trusting like the local police or like law enforcement. In GEOS areas, it was 3%. In Damascus, it was literally 0%. No one trusted the police there or like the judicial system. I think I will just mention one more bit, which is related to the protection thresholds, the 22 protection thresholds shared by UNHCR. And through our sample, only 4 of those thresholds were partially met. 16 of those were not met. Like, it was clear that those protection thresholds are not met for those returnees, and 2 of them were unclear. Now, I'm afraid that we were not able to grasp the current trend during this report, but since Erbil in Iraq and Egypt started granting Syrians visas, we have noticed a huge flow of Syrians, mainly from GOS areas, to these 2 locations. And again, in this case, it's people who were able to actually afford the visa fees and the flight tickets, in a sense that it's not financial migration, as some may like to paint it, but in reality, it is mainly related to the sustainability and the security of the situation inside Syria. With this note, I go back to you, Sama. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kenan. And also lately with the UAE started, especially in the Expo in Dubai, started also make it easier for Syrians to get visa to Dubai. And we have noticed a huge number of Syrians, especially young men, are fleeing the country, especially from Damascus, trying to find maybe a better life conditions there. Thank you so much, Kenan, for sharing that. I will now move to Willem. So Willem, Mary gave us case studies about people experienced horror when they are back to Syria. Kenan tried to give us some quantitative information about the country and if it is safe to go back. I would like to hear from you more about the report that the RPW developed, the paper where you are trying to present and ask and research the protection issues facing Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and discussing international monitoring mechanism for the safe, voluntary, informed, and dignified return of displaced Syrians. Would like to hear from you. If you can, please unmute yourself. And thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And good afternoon, everybody. So indeed, I will be focusing a bit more on the issue of monitoring. I'll maybe start with a very brief background on why we focus so much on that issue, and then I'll go into a bit more detail about specific options. So I myself, I'm today representing Refugee Protection Watch, RPW, so which is a coalition of 5 Syrian, Lebanese, and European organizations, Basme Zetoune, Aleph, Pax, Opinion, and my own organization, 1111. And so RPW was established in 2019, and we are, since we have been doing and are doing our own data collection inside Syria in Lebanon in order to answer one main research question, namely, have conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified return, as outlined in the 2018 UNHCR protection thresholds, have they been met or not in Syria? And so we've been publishing our own data findings, which I will not go through, because I think they're very much in line with what Marie and Keenan outlined earlier. So when turning to recommendations and how to deal with this issue, as RPW, Refugee Protection Watch, over the past two and a half years, we've been very much focusing on the issue of monitoring, because, yeah, as we see it, there is really a need for greater involvement of international actors in monitoring efforts. There are already a lot of NGO efforts ongoing, RPW, VDSF, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and many other colleagues from Syrian organizations and networks. But still, there's a lack of more sustained international effort to do so. In order to make a bit more of a specific contribution to that discussion as RPW, last summer, so in July 2021, we published a thematic research paper that assessed more in detail 6 specific options to do so. So to monitor conditions for safe, voluntary, dignified return inside Syria, which included also 4 options within the UN human rights system. Namely ad hoc reporting by the UN Commission of Inquiry and or the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Also, we discussed the option and the advantages, disadvantages of a UN fact-finding mission, and then finally also the option of the creation of a UN special procedure. In the end, and I'll come back to that in a minute, I think we concluded that, at least in the short term, the option of greater involvement of the UN Commission of Inquiry seems most promising out of these 4 Geneva-based options. But yeah, I'll explain in a minute. But for today, for today's session, I would like basically to focus on 3 main questions. So first is, maybe a very basic and obvious question, but I think nevertheless important to highlight, namely, why should the UN human rights system pay particular specific attention to the plight of displaced Syrians amidst ongoing rights violations that also, of course, much more broader than just violations against displaced Syrians. Then second question that I would like to touch upon briefly is, zooming in on this specific option of the UN Commission of Inquiry, to give a bit of an overview of what the Commission has been doing and saying so far about returns and conditions for return, and also what they haven't been saying or doing so far. And then third main issue is, of course, then looking forward, which specific actions can be taken by the UN human rights system in Geneva in the short to medium term to address this issue. So to start with the first question, so why should the UN human rights system pay specific attention to human rights violations against displaced Syrians? I think a couple of things to highlight here are that, and maybe to start with, is that there's a general recognition that international human rights standards are particularly relevant for displaced persons who are often at an increased risk for violations of their rights, which has also been, of course, which may sound very obvious, but which has been reiterated times and again, also by the Office of the High Commissioner, which has stated in the past, and then I quote, that precisely because returnees and IDPs are in a situation of displacement from their homes, they are more vulnerable to abuses of their rights and may therefore require a more specific form of human rights legal protection than other persons who have not been displaced. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I think in a similar vein, the Office of the High Commissioner has also developed several training manuals. We also refer to it more in detail in our paper. So specific manuals on the monitoring and the protection of human rights of refugees and IDPs. And there again, highlighted quite explicitly how refugee returnees, IDPs, are at a particular enhanced risk from human rights violations. But that's of course at the more general level. Then zooming in on the issue of displaced Syrians. I think it's also important to highlight that specific vulnerabilities, specific human rights risks that displaced Syrians are faced with have been repeatedly reiterated by the Human Rights Council. And to just give you an idea of that, out of the 17 resolutions that the Council has adopted in the past 6 years, so since June 2016, 15 out of 17 resolutions have paid specific attention to the human rights situation of displaced Syrians. And then, of course, as I guess most people here will know very well, there was also this very strong statement during the last Council session in September 2021, where the Commission of Inquiry has been quite outspoken and vocal about the issue, stating that, and then again, I'm quoting, this is no time for anyone to think that Syria is a country fit for its refugees to return to. So that brings me to the second main point that I would like to make today is, what has the Commission of Inquiry been doing and saying about returns and conditions for returns so far? So in recent years, the Commission has actually on several occasions already paid, to a certain extent, particular attention to the human rights situation of Syrian refugees, IDPs, returnees. Two things to highlight here are two reports by the Commission of Inquiry. So the first one is a September 2018 report by the Commission that outlined a number of general principles related to the right of return, with a particular focus on HLP rights as well. And then there was another Commission of Inquiry report issued in February 2019, which made a series of recommendations and like basic preconditions for any kind of sustainable return. And in which they, by outlining this several issues, among others, the Commission of Inquiry touched upon the need for substantial permanent reduction of hostilities, guarantees by all parties that returnees will not face persecution, discrimination, arbitrary detention, torture, or any other form of mistreatment at all. And then also, conditions related to restoration of critical infrastructure, access to basic services, existence of mechanisms to address HLP rights, and so on. And I think it's also interesting and important to highlight here that many of these issues outlined by the Commission of Inquiry bear quite strong similarities with the UNHCR protection thresholds that Keenan also referred to, which is a list of 22 conditions that UNHCR published in 2018, and which makes a bit more specific what exactly constitutes safe, voluntary, dignified return in a specific Syria context. But so going back to the Commission of Inquiry, I think from our perspective as Refugee Protection Watch, I think of course it's important to highlight that I think that these two reports were very strong reports, were very important reports and important first steps. But unfortunately, the Commission of Inquiry has to date not published a comprehensive standalone report in which it really zooms in a bit more detailed way, in line with presentations by Keenan, by Marie, on conditions for safe, voluntary, dignified return. And as RPW, what we are very much advocating for is that the Commission of Inquiry would do that. So either by including a more specific focus on conditions for return and human rights of displaced Syrians in its regular reporting, or alternatively to issue a standalone report, a comprehensive standalone report on the issue, which it of course could take an own initiative for, or it could be requested by the Human Rights Council to do so. And they're also important to highlight, emphasize that there are many precedents to do so, specifically in the Syria context. So if you look back at the resolutions that have been adopted by the Council in the past decade, there have been many cases in which the Council asked the Commission of Inquiry to issue a standalone report. So most recently, in June 2020, the Council requested a special report on arbitrary imprisonment and detention. The same month, June 2020, there was also a request by the Council for, and I quote, a comprehensive independent special inquiry into the military escalation in Idlib. There have been such requests for the situation, for a special report looking into the issue of the siege of Aleppo, the situation in Eastern Ghouta, and so on. So I think what all these examples make very clear is that precedents exist for the Commission to either take its own initiative or be requested by the Council to issue such reports. So I'll leave it at that at this point, but of course, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Willem, for sharing the findings and touching on some recommendations. So I would like now to open the floor for questions. Please, if you have any, drop them in the Q&A section, or you can ask the host to give you or unmute you so you are able to share the question directly. I have already received some. So let me please share those with you. Yasmin is asking you, Marie, about the way that the Turkish government is dealing also with Syrian refugees in Turkey and all the violations happening, the racism, the discrimination against them, the deportation. It's not a very specific question, but in general, she would like to know your ideas about the attitude by the Turkish government toward refugees.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So Amnesty International is concerned by the way the Turkish government is treating Syrian refugees. We documented several cases of deportation of Syrian refugees, which amount to refoulement and which violates international law without any doubts. I cannot go so much into the specifics of what is happening in Turkey now because we haven't documented violations beyond deportation recently. And as you know, Amnesty International grounds everything into research. So I'd rather not comment on what is not based into our own research. But what I would like to highlight, and I forgot to say during the presentation, is that one of the reasons why Syrian refugees are perceived as opponents when they return to Syria is related to the country where they were displaced. And countries whose governments is perceived as against the Syrian authorities, these are the countries that or where the refugees come from have problems. And there is, I have in mind this woman who returned with her 2 daughters in Syria from Turkey. And when she arrived at the border crossing, she was interrogated and the officer told her, oh, but you're Turkish, you're a terrorist, you're an Erdoganist. So it really shows that Syrian people are really between the stone and the hard place. Like they suffer from violation, discrimination in Turkey. And when they return to Syria, they also are accused because they were refugees in Turkey. So I think that's also an important point to have in mind.
Mm-hmm. And also, Yasmin has a follow-up question. What we can do to push governments and states not to sign any agreements where Syrians are pushed back to Syria? Do you have any suggestions?
The thing is, it's not based on an agreement. Governments like neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, who deport Syrian people, they just arrest them and send them back. It's out of any legal procedure. It is sending back people to a country where they will be persecuted and where they are at real risk of suffering serious human rights violations violates international law. And this is customary law. So whether countries, Lebanon, Syria, have ratified this convention, have incorporated that law into their national law, doesn't matter. This is customary law. So no country should deport refugees who are at risk of persecution, and our report shows that any refugees is potentially at risk. We're not saying that everyone will be at risk if returned. We're saying that everyone could be because of the perception associated with being a refugees. So, like to answer more directly the question, I mean, we think the best way to prevent that is to really alert every time that there is a deportation that we can document, verify, and cross-check, and before it takes place, which doesn't happen often enough, I have to admit, we will publish a statement, and we will raise attention on it, and we will call for it. And actually, just at the time of the release of the reports, there were 9 Syrian refugees who were in detention in Lebanon. And we knew they were going to be deported. And so, like the local media and us at Amnesty, we released a statement calling for authorities not to deport them. And in the end, they were not deported. So I guess one of the key is being aware of this deportation, which is difficult because when refugees are in detention, they don't have means of communication. But when we are aware of it, we can raise attention with the help of civil society, NGOs, media, and pressure governments not to deport refugees.
Thank you so much, Mary. We have 2 questions on the data collection. We have one question from Nisreen and another from Nizar. So Nisreen is asking about the accuracy of those statistics and how they have been collected, how we reach people, and how we were able to make sure that those people are somehow legitimate people sharing experience. I think this could be asked to Kinan also, since you did a lot of quantitative data and surveys. Would you like to answer this, Kinan?
Once I am able to unmute myself. Okay, well, I think Marie could also play a role in this. For us, we are definitely aware that our sample may not be representative due to its sample. That is something that we do like explicitly mention. Nevertheless, we did use, we did focus in our methodology on, the usage of a trained team that is in the field, so that the collection was actually collected in person, not through Skype or like phone calls. I mentioned that it was quite challenging to get people to get comfortable enough to share their experiences, especially with like the returning process or like journey. While we like, and on that note, actually, I would like to highlight that the numbers that we have, we are assuming to be the minimum, in a sense that we were only able to, like, the initial number, sample number was quite higher. We were only able to speak to like relevantly smaller number of persons, in a sense that those are the ones who felt confident enough that they can share. Like from a Syrian perspective, you know that we all do our due diligence before we decide to take any step. In Arabic, that can be translated into إنه حدا يفيش قبل ما يرجع البلد. And I just realized I might be using the wrong channel. I'm terribly sorry about this inconvenience.
I think that's fine. We can hear you on the English channel, yes.
Okay. So with that said, we were actually ensuring that the data collection taking place is like, we were checking the lifetime of the data collection, where we were checking the like the GSP pretty much of each data collector. This was like, again, very sensitive. We did have a very long consent form that allows people to, like, even after participate, to withdraw their statements, or to again to like the amount of like security risks that can be affiliated with such data shared was quite significant. Now we also realized the shortage in this research, again, with the limitation, like with the limitation of the sample. It may not be representative, that's for sure. I think I will also jump to Hannah's question. I see it in the chat here. And yes, thank you very much for asking. Now, this is exactly why we mentioned that according to people's statements. The question here asks about how did we, like, to elaborate more on the UN facilitated returns for those 13 individuals. So again, this is according to their own statements. In what they shared with us is that either to, like, as they shared, UN personnel has asked them if they really want to return, like in 2 of those cases. So they did conduct an interview with them before they returned. Those cases were from Lebanon. And for others, it was them saying that, yes, they were, like, to them, they were UN personnel at either the border crossing or the line, and those are the ones who ensured that we can return. So these were the experiences they shared with us. I hope this answers the question. Otherwise, please feel free to follow up. On that note, I think I have quite answered the question. Maybe, I don't know if Marie would care to weigh in, or Willem.
Yeah, and also, Marie, there's a question by Nizar asking how easy it was to reach people inside Syria to do interviews with, or to ask them for their own experiences, especially in regime-held areas. What were the main challenges, and if you can share any of those?
It was extremely challenging to find people willing to talk on this topic. Because of course, once they return, they are afraid. They're afraid to be submitted to violations, and when they are inside Syria, it's extremely challenging. So yes, it was a very long and painstaking work to really find each of the interviewees. Of course, the main priority for Amnesty is the safety of people we interview. So most of interviews I did were interviews of people who were outside of Syria, because as I explained during the presentation, it's people who went back and left again the country. So they were, they left Syrian government-controlled territory, to be more accurate. So either these people had came back to Lebanon, and I interviewed them in Lebanon, either physically or on the phone. Some of them had left again, but to the northern part of Syria, where they believed it was safe enough for them to speak. Some of them also returned to Rukban camp. I didn't have the chance in the presentation to talk about the specific cases of Rukban people, but maybe there will be a question later about this. And in some cases, we had people who were in a government control area, part city, and they traveled to a part where it was safe for them to speak. We are also careful with finding the right internet provider, so that it was not Syrian internet provider when we were doing these interviews, but for instance, Turkish one when it was closer to the north. So it's all like really case by case and really taking care of each individual circumstances to guarantee safety. But yes, it was difficult for them to speak. And if I can add a little bit on the reliability of people. So we at Amnesty, we don't do quantitative research, and so that's great to see how our work can complement. So we do purely qualitative, and so all the interviews we conducted, it's based on like intermediaries and the network we can have. We rely on colleagues. Some people who are on this call helped me to access and find the people. So that's because it's people who know people that we can assess the reliability, and also with the experience on working on Syria and documenting violations in Syria. Also, you know what makes sense and what is coherent. And I would like just to add something also about the question of is it representative? And it's only 66 cases we documented, as Kinan mentioned earlier, because it's a key issue. We believe at Amnesty that it is enough and it is representative because first it covers a long period of time between early 2018 and mid 2021, so it's quite long. It covers a wide area inside Syria, not just one border crossing, one town or one governorate. It covers a large area, and the stories are consistent, and above all, the violations documented fit the pattern of the violations committed by the Syrian government since the beginning of the conflict. So all this allows us to say that these 66 cases are representative of the violations that refugees could face when they return. I hope that answers the different questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Marie. I think, Kenan, you would like to follow up with something. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, it's one minor point which I think Marie have also used in her methodology. We had to even design the questionnaires or like the interviews in a sense that we slowly build confidence through the interview. That was one of the factors. And we could see how much people were horrified and like scared of even sharing their own experiences in the sense that they might be prosecuted just for sharing what they were facing, especially on their return journey. It's a point that I don't know if Mary would shed some light on, but there's also this argument that these violations used to happen in a certain period of time, and right now the perspective of the Syrian government or like other parties of the conflict has changed in a sense that now they are welcoming returnees, especially with the conference that took place. And again, even numbers prove that this is not the case. All the numbers that I have shared with you were actually documented for the last 12 months. I don't know if also like Marie, you would like to weigh in about like your sample and the timeline of the violations that took place.
Thank you, Kenan. Marie, would you like to share anything else, or should we move to the next question?
I think the scope and the timing and the timeline. So yeah, I think I covered it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, the violations are still violations, even if they happened a few months earlier. But actually, this is what we are trying maybe to focus on today. And lately, we have been hearing that specific representatives from the regime government are talking about how important it is for refugees to go back. So hopefully we will be able to also understand if this is the reality on the ground or not. I would like to actually share something that we didn't plan for. So today we have someone who with us in this event who experienced upon return to Syria violations, and I would like to check if you, Widad, would like to share your first-hand experience. You are now safe in Sweden. And you put on the chat in Arabic how you were tortured by the regime after going back to Syria, how you tried to flee the country, and then you were able to bring your 2 children with you to Sweden. Would you like, with that, please, to share your experience? Please go ahead. Thank you so much for offering that, with that.
مرحبا.
أهلا مدام.
صوتي مسموع؟
تمام.
أوكي.
مسموع كتير تمام.
كما كتبت بالرسالة، أنا سيدة سورية تعرضت للاعتقال في دمشق. كنت أعمل في مجال القانون، كان لدي شركة تعمل في مجال الأعمال القانونية في سوريا لمدة 13 عام. لم يسبق لي أبداً إطلاقاً أن أخالف القوانين في أي شيء، إنما بعد ما استخدم النظام مسألة القصف على البيوت وتهجير الناس من مكان إلى مكان، حاولت مساعدة الأسر فقط التي يعني الذين لديهم أطفال ولا يعني أصبحوا بلا مأوى بلا مكان، انتقلوا من مكان إلى آخر، فكنت أساعدهم بسيارتي، أخذهم إلى مثلا أو أحاول أن أؤمن لهم سكن، والجريح ممكن أن نساعده لأنه لا يجرؤ على الذهاب إلى المستشفى. هذه الأعمال فقط. بناء عليه كنت في أحد الأيام ذاهبة إلى عملي في دمشق. فتم سحبي من قبل 7 أشخاص، جروني في الشارع ووضعوني في سيارة، ثم أخذوني إلى مكان 50 درجة تحت الأرض. لم أعرف يعني إلى الآن لا أعرف هذا المكان أين هو. تم التحقيق معي بطريقة جدا وحشية وبطريقة جدا بشعة. وكانت الثورة السورية في بدايتها في ذلك الحين، فحاولوا أن يعني كانوا يريدون أن لا تسمى ثورة بالبداية، لذلك أطلقوا سراحي. كنا متعودين أنه الذي يدخل المعتقل لا يخرج، إحنا هذا الشيء الذي نعرفه. لكن عندما خرجت حاولت أنه يعني أبعد عن أنظار النظام، لأنه أي مساعدات بسيطة للناس كانت تحسب أعمال سياسية، كنت تعتبر شخص إرهابي. فخرجت، استطعت أن أخرج من سوريا بمساعدة السويد. طبعا جاءتني دعوة من السويد، جئت إلى السويد بشكل شرعي. ولكن بعد أن وصلت للسويد صاروا يعني أصبحوا يهددون بناتي. عندي طفلتين كانوا تحت السن القانوني، يعني قاصر، بنتين. فحاولوا أنه يعني يهددوني بالبنات أنهم سيعتقلوهم، وأنا أعرف أن النظام السوري يستطيع أن يفعل هيك شيء. فشيء مألوف بسوريا أن تعتقل أطفال وتعذب الأطفال. يعني أعرف الكثير من الأسر الذين لديهم أطفال تحت السن القانوني تعرضوا للاغتصاب، سواء كانوا صبيان أو بنات، يعني نفس الشيء. فعندما يعني بدأت رسائل التهديد تأتيني، أخبرت دائرة الهجرة السويدية هنا. ثم تمت مساعدتي حتى استطعت تهريب البنات ليلا إلى الأردن، وبقوا هناك لفترة، ثم استطعت أن أجلبهم للسويد. بعد ذلك أصبحوا يهددوني بأخواتي وأمي. وأمي إنسانة عاجزة لا تعمل بالسياسة ولا تفقه شيء بالسياسة. أصبحوا يهددوني بأهلي أنه سوف نرجع لك، يعني تعودين لهنا بالغصب. يعني كانت أيام قاسية جدا. والأقسى من ذلك هنا في السويد، يعني اللاجئ السوري عندما يخرج من الوطن لا ينجو كليا، لأنه سيتعرض بعد ذلك لتعذيب نفسي. يعني ما أراه هنا في السويد مثلا على سبيل المثال أنهم يحاولون محي هويتنا. ممنوع أن تتكلم بلغتك، يجب أن تتأقلم مع البلد التي تسكن بها. تعطى للاجئين أسوأ أنواع الوظائف، وظائف العمالة البسيطة، يعني أردأ. مهما كانت شهادتك الجامعية، مهما كنت مهما في بلدك، فأنت هنا يجب أن تتأقلم مع البلد وتقبل بالقليل. يعني حياة فيها نوع من الإذلال للمواطن. يجب أن تمحي هويتك، تنسى لغتك. وأنا هنا أتكلم عن أفضل الدول الأوروبية، يعني دولة من أفضل الدول الأوروبية باتجاه اللاجئين. فمأساة السوري يعني ليست فقط داخل الحدود، إنما أيضا خارج الحدود، وهي لا توصف. هذا فقط ما أردت أن لا أريد أن أطيل عليكم. شكرا لاستماعكم.
Thank you, Widad, for sharing your. Thank you, Widad, for sharing your own experience and for accepting to share it with our attendees. I would like to move to a question. I think Willem, maybe you would like to answer this question. The question is asking, how do we think the findings or the recommendations of the reports might change the policies by different governments and different states toward refugees in the countries that hosting refugees.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I think there are, of course, a very important question. I think a couple of reasons there why we are focusing as RPW so much on the issue of monitoring. I think from us, our starting point is the current reality in which there is, I would say a gray zone, like a lot of ambiguity, about the question of return, because of the lack of a clear international mechanism that monitors and that reports on it. I think that allows certain actors to wrongfully claim that Syria or parts of Syria are safe for return. I think it also results in a situation in which Syrians themselves, who might be considering to go back or are contemplating the decision don't have sufficient access to any kind of objective, reliable information. And I think that then often leads them to a return decision to then find out, as I think very clearly shown by, for example, the Amnesty reports, that conditions are not in place for return, leading to this phenomenon of return, and so basically having a dynamic of premature return that leads to more return and more displacement. And I think a third main consequence of this gray zone, this current gray zone, is that there's no incentive at all for the Syrian government to change its behavior. And I'm of course not implying that by just having a monitoring mechanism that the Syrian government or other actors for that matter will all of a sudden start to behave. But I think it is, or it might offer at least a limited form of incentive to make some changes. And I think by putting in place a more internationally led monitoring effort, that many of these consequences can be tackled. Of course, we're not naive in the sense that we are saying like if there's just a monitoring, everything will be fine and this will be like a magical solution. Of course not. But I do think, or we are convinced that such a mechanism, be it through the Commission of Inquiry or it can also be a combination, a more structural effort by UNHCR or other more region-based efforts, that having that mechanism could potentially mitigate against many of the worst consequences. So it would make it harder, not impossible, but it would make it harder for certain governments to wrongfully claim that conditions are in place for return. It would mitigate against the risk of premature return and people taking return decisions on the basis of inaccurate information, to then only to come back and try to return to neighboring host countries. And such a mechanism by if there's like irregular reporting, which is then also the basis of international discussions on return, I think that might also provide at least a minimum incentive for the government of Syria, but also other actors to change their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Willem. So today we covered 3 different reports. The reports are approaching the issue of returnees and refugees from different, let's say, angles and realities. I would like to wrap up by asking each of our panelists to summarize the main recommendations your reports are offering. Could we start with you, Marie?
Yes. So our main recommendations are first towards European governments mainly, but also countries who have resettlement programs for Syrian refugees. And we call them to grant the refugee status to people who have left Syria, and not only temporary protection, because we think it's not enough and doesn't address the reality of the risk that we highlight in the report. And we call countries who host Syrian refugees to maintain their protection to Syrian refugees who are living in their countries now. Second, we're calling neighboring countries, especially to end all deportation of refugees to Syria, as well as other forms of direct and indirect transfers, and to maintain their protection of Syrian refugees. We are also calling European countries to include the criteria of human rights violations when assessing the safety of an area for return. For instance, Denmark is considering that Damascus area is safe, mainly based on the criteria of indiscriminate attack. But it is not the only criteria to consider that an area is safe, and the criteria of respect of human rights violations should be included. And finally, we have recommendations for Lebanon. We're calling Lebanon to provide Syrian refugees with a regular migration status, which protects them from refoulement, We're calling Lebanon to grant permission to UNHCR to once again register new refugees so they can have a status. And importantly, we're calling Lebanon to allow legal re-entry into Lebanon to refugees who returned to Syria and decided to leave again, because at the moment, because it's not legal for them to re-enter Lebanon, they put themselves at risk again when leaving Syria. So in order for them to be safe, we're calling Lebanon to make re-entry legal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Kenan, would you like to share your main recommendations, please?
Well, in addition to agreeing with Marie and definitely backing up the creation of a monitoring, if not mechanism, the wording can be figured out, but it's definitely much needed. Well, it's as simple as it goes. Understanding that refugee hosting countries and other stakeholders do have an interest in refugees leaving their areas. The short reality, the clear reality is that if we're looking for some permanent solutions, some long-term solutions, not to just push numbers of people inside Syria where they will take either negative coping mechanisms or simply just sell their property or anything they have and then try to immigrate again, is to avoid this premature return and set the conditions that will allow them to return voluntarily and on term. Understanding that the longer this crisis goes, the higher percentage of Syrians, especially the younger the age, the younger the duration, the less they are willing or planning to return. But again, it's the physical transportation of one person from one location to another. It does not qualify as a durable solution or as an end to a problem. If we're looking to avoid all the follow-up implications that will take place, we should definitely just ensure that those protection thresholds are in place before starting this return of Syrians. Back to you.
Thank you, Kenan. Willem, you already shared some of the recommendations, but it would be great if you can summarize them quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, not much to add. I think, first of all, very much second everything that Marie and Kenan said. So it's very much in line with our messages and recommendations as Refugee Protection Watch. And then, yeah, of course, it will not surprise you that monitoring is key for us. So I think specifically for the Geneva level, I think two things that can happen. Or that we would like to see happening. So first is, of course, this specific role of the Commission of Inquiry. So either the Commission itself taking the initiative to publish a standalone report on conditions for return, or alternatively, it could also be requested by the Human Rights Council in one of the Syria resolutions, so either at this session or the upcoming session in June and July. If that would not be possible, I think one other alternative option to consider for the Human Rights Council, and we point to that in the RPW paper, the link of which was shared, is that the Human Rights Council could also include language in one of its upcoming Syria resolutions, basically asking the Office of the High Commissioner to make an assessment on conditions of return, but also, and most importantly, to ask the Office of the High Commissioner to make recommendations on the appropriate follow-up for the Human Rights Council to consider. And there, in the paper, we also identified some precedents, some model language taken from previous council resolutions on other contexts. So I think there, the language is there. It can easily be added to a council resolution if, of course, the political will is there. And then, so either one goes for the Commission of Inquiry track or asks the Office of the High Commissioner to present a menu of options for the most appropriate follow-up.
Thank you so much, Willem. We have received on the chat a question by Julia, which I think, Kinan, you replied to Julia. So Julia is asking what are the legal tools that could be addressed by someone who has been deported from Turkey to Northwest Syria and deported to the detention camp and who is now illegally in Turkey. You mentioned, Julia, that the case has been reported to Amnesty, refused by the UE Human Rights Court, and now under the UN Special Procedure supported by a Turkish lawyer. So Kinan is suggesting communicating with a private lawyer for who can move things forward, but would like to know if any others have any other suggestions to Julia. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for your for joining us for this side event. Thank you to our panelists and for the sponsors organizations. Hope all will be good. We will share with you, or we will share on social media the recording of this session. We also shared the links to the reports and other relevant reports that you could check and read. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.
And a huge thanks goes to our interpreters for today.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Also, Nara and Usama for your support, for your RT support.
Thank you very much, Usama, for your facilitation. Have a nice day.
Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.